He also holds a secondary position at the University of Gutenberg. Oscar Westman is specialized in digital journalism, fact-checking platforms, media management, news consumption and mobile. He is the editor-in-chief of the renowned digital journalism journal, and has also been responsible for special editions of several other important international scientific journals. He's currently involved in several research projects focused on disinformation, and he is one of the consultants of this project, MediaTrust.Lab. So the closing conference is entitled News, Media and Fact Checkers Amidst an Age of Platformization. Professor Oscar Westman, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to come here. I'm very honored and delighted to finally get to see the premises of this university. And I've composed a presentation that will link platformization and platforms to news media on the one hand, discussing journalism and to some extent also local journalism that I know that you have great expertise around, and on the other hand the relationship between platforms and fact checkers and fact checking practices. I want to start with the rise of mobile ecosystems and platforms around 2007, 2008. It was a time at which I was doing my own PhD dissertation, following in the close footsteps of one of the major news companies in Sweden and how they approached mobile media and social media at the time. So the front page of my dissertation here, Cross-Media Newswork, Sense-Making of the Mobile Media Revolution, is meant to capture a 125-year-old newspaper organization focusing much on local and regional news at the train station. And this was a metaphor that they themselves were using at the time, looking at the traditional newspaper in print coming to a halt, idling at the train station, envisioning a future of decline where print subscriptions would eventually discontinue. And we have seen that happen in a transition towards online. And most importantly, they were looking at the new train coming to the station with great speed and eventually being fueled by smartphones. I started following them before Apple had announced the iPhone, and it was quite an interesting journey to see how they adapted to the evolution and innovation around mobile media. And this coincided with social media platforms, and to many extents it was marked by some optimism, but also lots of challenges. Of course, the global recession that came in 2008 had a mark on these developments, and they symbolically worked with sort of initiatives towards mobile news publishing and social media. Why am I saying all of this? Well, to some extent, this marked a disruption to how news publishers work with their distribution. Because up until then, they were in control of their distribution. Newspapers had for a long time taken pride in having printing presses of their own and creating a website that they owned, controlled, and to which they could engage in cross-media news work, publishing the news across different platforms. But when they started publishing news for smartphones, they relinquished this control. They let Apple decide much of the sort of formatting and design of the app, and they also agreed to let Apple take a 30% cut of all their revenues. So it was not an uncomplicated decision. But there was very little discourse around this. Only some of their technologists were raising this as a concern, whereas most of the editorially oriented staff members were discussing the possibilities for innovating journalism for new platforms. And similarly, with the growth of social media platforms, much of the discourse was around we need to be there to capture this young audience that is going on mobile phones and towards social media platforms. We need to create the presence where they are. And some of these discussions around being where others are very critical, and we've seen, and in the words of Mark Doise, how people have developed media lives where the different screens, the different media are essentially becoming one with that of our own lives. We're not only using the media are becoming part of us as extensions of ourselves. And we have seen a development where citizens, the public, are increasingly being exposed to content, news, but also disinformation and entertainment content across many different screens. These screens have different affordances and capacities, and whereas the public perhaps are not really reflecting on the importance of what screens, what windows to the world that they are dedicating their attention and engagement to, this has really critical consequences for the future of journalism and how we can sustain a sort of a business model for the future of journalism. In short, over the last 20 years, we have seen a mega trend commonly referred to as platformization. Nyborg and Poel defined platformization as the penetration of economic, governmental, and infrastructural extensions of digital platforms into the web and app ecosystems, fundamentally affecting the operations of media industries and production practices. Moreover, they write, professional media making is influenced, even governed by a platform logic that conditions market and editorial logics. Media makers gravitate their production and circulation strategies towards the algorithms of specific platforms. We know that platforms, and these are operating across many different sectors, of course. It's not only the big tech giants from Silicon Valley, but also we see platform companies in other sectors with Airbnb and Uber and Bolt, etc. They're sort of acting as intermediaries. But in the context of journalism and fact-checking, we have platform companies that are acting as intermediaries between the news producers and the public as a recipient, where the intermediaries are gaining access to sort of and can govern the exposure of content through different algorithmic operations with personalization and so forth, gaining access to the data and getting a huge cut of advertising revenues and also reader revenues. In a book that my colleague Professor Sten Stensen and I published a couple of years ago, which we are quite happy is open access. We had secured some funding and can actually make this open access, so it's free to download for everyone. We discussed essentially 5 premises of the field, and in conjunction to this lecture amid an age of platformization, I wanted to mention some of their connections to platforms more explicitly. We see a massive shift in crisis in revenue models for journalism. In this context, platforms are dominating digital advertising. I believe Alphabet with Google and Meta with Facebook, Instagram, and so forth have around 75% of the global digital advertising pie. I believe Amazon has approximately 8%. Then we can still account for that these are not operating in all of the global markets, including China. We have seen this massive shift, and this means that many traditional news companies in the global north are today getting most of their revenues from the readers, whereas they used to have a smaller portion of reader revenues unless they were tabloids. And this means that the readers are now becoming the employers of journalism. Previously it was just a small, like 20-25% revenue stream, whereas most of it was subsidized through advertising revenues. This means a huge shift and is associated also to a metrics-driven or data-driven journalism, where journalists are more concerned with giving audiences what the audiences want, to cite McChesney, which is quite important in a context where most of the revenue must come from the readers. And this is connected to this increased emphasis on user data and audience analytics and metrics in journalism, but the platforms are having the superior data. And importantly, even though news publishers are developing their own analytics infrastructures, and they can, in that way, get access to lots of metrics based on their own platforms, their website and their apps, etc. They are dependent on third-party platforms to know the behaviors on these third-party platforms. And the third-party platforms are not necessarily having standardized ways of measuring the data, not necessarily giving them all of the data, which is problematic, of course. We're seeing shifting patterns of distribution in which companies non-proprietary to institutions and journalism have gained dominance over time, giving lots of power to these platforms. We're seeing, of course, some significant shifts. We used to have Facebook dominating, and also Google through search engine optimization. Both Facebook and Twitter have reduced impact in terms of leading traffic towards news publishers, but we see that other third-party platforms are gaining significance. Essentially, journalism has become more vulnerable to manipulation, disinformation, and this is also connected to a consequent lack of public trust. Part of this has to do with the news output coming from the epistemic practices of journalism being dislocated from the core of news institutions. So it's being dislocated, separated from their institutions and their own platforms to other contexts. Just as a point of reference, public service broadcaster in Sweden, SVT, detect more than 15,000 attempts of manipulating, for instance, their own newscasts, alternating what they're saying using AI technology, or alternating the subtitles, putting it in a different context. You can take the video from the public service broadcaster, but when that video is manipulated and circulated on social media, it may appear as if it origins from the public service broadcaster, but being separated onto social media, it comes with problems. Also, we're seeing a tremendous shift in how we perceive journalists wanting to have an impact on social media and being influencers. Previously, it was taken for granted that journalists should have a strong presence on social media, promoting their own work. But with the rise of online harassment and hate threats and so forth, which is being easily done through social media platforms, we're seeing a shift where, at least in some areas like politics and topic areas such as immigration and such, that the news institutions try to actually have journalists having less sort of a presence on social media. It may actually be better for them to be perfectly anonymous, or that they publish with multiple names or under the institutional name, because they're being threatened by the public, or different types of what Sylvia Weisberg will call mob censorship, where they are mobilizing. And this oftentimes comes from the far right, and we're seeing far right movements coming in many countries in Europe and also in the US, which is changing, and we see this fake news as a label discourse threatening public institutions of journalism. Quite a lot there, and essentially we say that one premise of the field also is that news has become essentially separated from journalism in these different dislocation processes. And I'm going to go through some developments. We did sort of conceptualize this as a building of a platform presence in the book, where and I'm sorry if this is offending some of you, we still see lots of research in this sort of vein. Research within journalism studies and digital journalism studies working under the more normative assumption that institutions of journalism should build a presence on social media platforms. That is, it's being innovative to invest a lot of money and resources in publishing news for, in the early days, Facebook and Twitter, later Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, and so forth. But this doesn't come without some of the consequences, because even though there has been a rationale to build a platform presence, innovating with the formats, where organizations such as INMA has sort of tried to get its members to adapt and customize and being innovative with editorial practices, it's not a given that this is the best thing. Because what they're essentially doing is investing lots of resources in their editorial logics, adapting the content for platform logics to platform companies that can change their algorithms and their commercial operations. And they have done multiple times over the years. And I would say, ultimately, and this is just showing like CNN with some of their proprietary platforms at the center, but then a huge number of non-proprietary platforms to which they're dedicating resources to reach out. Oftentimes with the idea of gaining attention, making people familiarize with their brand, eventually becoming loyal and paying for the news by turning to subscription. But it's quite a long way from seeing a 7-second video on a video-oriented platform like TikTok or Snapchat to actually starting to go to the news source on an everyday basis and paying for a subscription. And as far as I know, few news companies are making a lot of people making that transition. Instead, we're seeing lots of publics that have become accustomed to thinking, I'll get exposed to the news when I'm on social media platforms. So we see different forms of approaches like I'll stumble upon the news or the news finds me, etc., etc. As a sort of a response, adaptation, strategic of sort to this development, Sherwin Shu and I found through a longitudinal study with publishers in Singapore that the publishers from 2016 to 19 engaged in activities that we chose to define as platform counterbalancing, in which they essentially tried to reduce their dependence on the platform companies. Does not necessarily mean that they cut the cord entirely with the platform companies, but it can mean, for instance, that they reduce the total volume of articles that they cross-circulate or make freely accessible on certain platforms, or the ways that they adapt the content for these platforms and the objectives of doing so. If they have had it very decentralized, they may perhaps centralize it. For instance, in the same context, looking at Norwegian public service broadcaster, over the last 2-3 years, they have gone from having more than 500 Facebook accounts to having only a handful. So essentially taking back much of the control, being much more deliberate in terms of how they cross-circulate news across non-proprietary platforms. But it's not an easy thing. We see from the book by Nielsen and Ganter, Power of Platforms, that some of the publishers engage in practices where they essentially say, if we cross-circulate content across many different social media platforms, we become less dependent on one. So if you look at this sort of on a helicopter perspective, it may seem like some publishers are engaging much more, but essentially it might be behind a strategy of not becoming too dependent on individual ones. But we're seeing some very, very important shifts here, and we should not normatively assume that the best publishers are those that are giving away their content for free, dedicating resources on putting journalistic news content in the hands of American tech giants to capitalize on this. And I see some different traditions here. So if we think about news and the distribution of news for proprietary platforms from the perspective of news publishers to that of non-proprietary. If we have a tradition of looking at the platforms as channels, we see theoretical frameworks such as normalization of journalism, normalization of Twitter, normalization of Instagram, normalization of social media, appropriation, adoption, extended reach and engagement. Those studies have typically embraced the platforms as something that can serve better for the publishers, but not really taking into consideration all the power dynamics that are at play and the sort of long-term negative consequences. Then, if perceived as platforms, we have two sort of main traditions. We have platform studies and we have infrastructure studies, and these problematize the role of algorithmic infrastructures exerting power through platform governance and causing trade-offs for the publishers. And the platform governance essentially is that they have community principles in which they can set their own rules for how they display and engage in exposure of content. Of course, there are mandates from national governments or from the EU to some extent to what type of content that they need to engage with content moderation. And it varies a lot across many countries, but there are many domains, including both news and misinformation, where the platforms themselves can decide how to act when they want to engage in this exposure. So this is really important, and overall this relates to the sort of technological conditions for freedom of expression and journalism amid platform power. And we organized a big conference at Oslo-Met together with Presenshus in Norway, and we had a huge team from Amsterdam visiting us with Natalie Hellberger and Klaus de Vries and others discussing this. And I just want to mention a session I led with the editor-in-chief for the biggest newspaper in Scandinavia, and also the news editor for the Norwegian public service broadcaster, and the representatives from TikTok and Meta. And essentially, if we begin with Meta, Facebook have been taking back much of their initiatives towards making news visible on their platform. It started most vividly in 2018 with the MSI algorithm, but over the last year we see huge decreases in the exposure of news on the platform and also how they treat it. Consequently, both VG and NRK are putting in less resources in trying to be visible on this platform. It's also connected to a shift in the demographics, where younger people and young adults are less engaged on the platform. On the other hand, we have TikTok, where VG have approached it and are creating content based on the platform logic of this platform, which is very entertainment focused, and where the algorithms are driven by the content and not the network of the users. But many companies, including NRK, are very concerned about TikTok and as a company and how they're using data and collecting data and so forth. So they're having sort of concerned discussions and approaches. So I just want to point this out sort of in the shift. And there are many things we need to consider here. And from a perspective of local journalism, of course, the platforms can play a huge role in the sense that some of these platforms are having a great significance across the world into the local areas, and context about news can be spread on a local level through social media platforms. But local players, unless they are sort of having the conditions like the Australian friends have gained in recent years, local news publishers have very little power to negotiate with the platforms, cannot exert any sort of control, which is quite problematic. And in terms of freedom of expression, one key area that we need to consider is that through their platform governance, the platforms engage in content moderation of editorial content. So I just want to take this recent study by colleagues at Oslo.Met, published in Journalism, that highlights how a team at NRK, the Norwegian public service broadcaster, follow their editorial professional practices of journalism, and they publish stories for Snapchat, adapting it to the Snapchat platform logic and wanting to reach the young audiences, which is a sort of ever-known problem of sort of gaining attention from the young, and in which they have experienced that the Snapchat content moderation team flag these stories and take the content off. For instance, because of commercial spam, bodily fluids, or including of tobacco, even if animated. So it's a sort of a contrast between a public service broadcaster, which in Norway has huge trust among the public, and an American platform company that choose to exert their power of platform governance by essentially deleting content that they think is inappropriate for the Norwegian public. And this theme of the platforms having the power to change the visibility of content is also at play when we look at fact-checking. We're just now finishing a rather long project on fact-checking and disinformation called SCAM, which we have led from Oslo.Met, together with colleagues in the United States, with Lucas Graves and Valerie Belair-Gagnon and Rebecca Larson, and includes a publication in disinformation studies here at the university. Thank you, Pedro. And I just want to sort of discuss some of these developments. So, up until the 2016 American presidential election, the fact-checking movement was mostly in the global north. It was not that developed globally, although there was a political fact-checking process. We have seen this global fact-checking community explode since. It consists of independent startups, fact-checking organizations and publishers working with professional standards that are organized through the International Fact-Checking Network at Point, or IFCN. The growth of the fact-checking community is much a response to problems with disinformation on social media platforms. And it has been fueled by platform partnerships, especially Meta's third-party fact-checking program, in which they have now more than 80 different organizations representing more than 60 languages. And companies like AFP in France have many sort of units in different countries. So one organization representing more than 100 different countries. But it's not an unproblematic relationship between fact-checkers and platforms. The platforms essentially have an ambition to identify misinformation that circulates on their platform and taking an action against it. It can be to remove it, it can be to flag it together with a fact check or taking other actions. And this is of course a symbolic gesture to some extent, not only to clean from this disinformation. And the fact checkers, we did an interview study with more than 60 fact checkers around the globe, highlight platform affordances and policies as key challenges for some of these partnerships. And there are different types of partnerships. And just want to mention some of the workings of the most significant one, the Meta partnership, where they require from their partners that they are members of IFCN, so that they're in that sense accredited as professional fact checkers, and they must do one fact check per week based on a material that circulates on the Facebook fact-checking product platform, which essentially is that if you log into your Facebook profile and they've tagged you as a fact checker, you open your professional fact-checking tab, and on that page you can see a list with the 10 highest ranked articles that may contain disinformation. It's black boxed by the sort of machines of AI saying that this article has a 73% likelihood of containing misinformation, and then you can scroll this list. And the fact checkers can in that way identify something that may contain misinformation or intentional disinformation, and then engage in a fact check on that. And if they do a fact check, coming to the conclusion that it was containing false information, Facebook will publish the fact check in conjunction to the original content. So they will not remove it entirely. Of course, coming from the US, this is connected to problems of being sued if they jeopardize freedom of expression. And it's closely tied to their algorithm, Meaningful Social Interaction, the MSI algorithm. So if we assume that I belong to the far right and I have a network of friends with whom I regularly interact around politics, and sort of we all sympathize with the far right movement, my peers will see that I shared this original article. And when it has been fact-checked, my peers are likely to also see the fact-check, but the original post will remain. However, others that sort of are not in my close network and have not seen this, they will not see the original post or the fact-check. Facebook have the sort of ambition to reduce the visibility to around 10% of the original projected visibility. And this is sort of the powers of the algorithms. TikTok, on the other hand, take a very different approach where they are instead removing the original disinformation content. And we as outsiders know less about what has happened and sort of with the content feeds. And since it's a content-driven platform, we don't see as much of sort of interaction from peers and so forth. YouTube, on the other hand, are not working with a third-party program for fact-checking content, and they have been very criticized for this. Some of you attended the Global Fact 9 conference, which we co-organized at Oslo Met with IFCN. We had both Meta and TikTok as sponsors. And YouTube sent one guy from Silicon Valley and sat there in front of several hundred fact checkers who are very critical to YouTube's stance and not helping. But essentially what we see is that the fact checkers are aware that there is lots of misinformation on YouTube, but they have no resources to grapple with it on their own. They are expecting Google and YouTube to provide technological tools and resources, and ideally also financing to make them engage with the content. And many fact checkers are defining that media review is beyond what they can do, that they can only work with claims made in textual formats. And of course, this is a huge limitation of what fact checkers can accomplish. And we also see other problematic areas here vividly expressed by fact checkers in the community, in which Meta are not allowing their fact checkers in the fact checking program to fact check political content. Of course, a fact checker working with Facebook as a partner, they may also have TikTok as a partner, they can still engage in political fact checking, but not on the platform itself. And just to mention one of the interviews from an article published by Lucas Graves and colleagues for the project, in which they conceptualized the debunking term. They're engaging in lots of boundary work around this Facebook partnership. So in quote, they're not doing any kind of fact check of ambition or substance. They're just going for the lowest hanging fruit to make a buck. That's what they're doing. They're mad because Facebook won't give them more bucks to do their not terribly ambitious work. Exactly. They pick the easiest stuff that they can do, the fastest, and they can build Facebook for. They have no ambition to do anything more than that. So we see some different sort of rhetorics and discourses among the fact-checking community about the role of the Facebook partnership, which is critical for the rise of the whole fact-checking community. Nevertheless, fact-checkers are concerned that the financing may not sustain, which would put an end to much of AFP's fact-checking operations and to many independent 1 to 2 person fact-checking companies. So this is really, really important to keep in mind about this partnership program. And AFP, for instance, have said that their partnership program has surfaced as one of the biggest revenues that they have altogether. And technology plays a significant role, because if YouTube are not providing technological means and they are choosing not to engage in fact-checking, this is not, of course, only for YouTube. This applies to many of the different platforms. And we have platforms as gated infrastructures onto which we are engaging with content and interacting with each other. And only if some of these platforms are being fact-checked, it's of course a huge societal problem, because disinformation does not have borders that are limited to certain platforms. The disinformation, when financed by economical initiatives or being motivated for political reasons, they will of course cross-circulate the disinformation across all of the platforms. And only some of them are being cleaned or depollinated or fact-checked. And in our project and for the Disinformation Studies book, we did a mapping of around 140 different technologies. We used sort of the practice of fact-checking as our guiding line for how to do the mapping, looking at the practice of identification, verification, and distribution, and identification of claims with false or true. Claims is a key practice in fact-checking. So we created this mapping based on the 4A's socio-technical framework. And we can see in sort of the identification phase, we have identifying checkable claims, traffic analysis, prioritization. The main actors here are fact-checkers, publishers, supported by platforms and tech providers. Some of this, we use the sort of labeling of tech-led or human-led. So essentially, in the case of Facebook having their algorithmic system populating a list of 10 articles that may contain misinformation with a signifier, here it's 73% likelihood. Of course, the fact checkers have more or less no clue how the articles ended up there, but they to some extent choose to rely on the system populating material that they can prioritize to work with. Audiences can also play a part here in content flagging if we see something of suspect sort. In the verification part, we have source verification, content verification, which can be also media review. And here the tech providers play an important role. And much of the providers here come, for instance, listed on the Bellingcat's list of open source tech companies. And this is really important because it's in the verification process where we have fact checkers engaging in human-led fact-checking practices, really engaging with the fact-checking of claims and so forth, using technological tools that are readily available and do not require any form of platform partnership or payment from the fact-checking organization to the tech companies. Whereas the identification part will require from the fact checkers to either be a partner with TikTok or Facebook, or they will act just as normal users trying to be part of Facebook groups or scrolling through these social media feeds in a more ad hoc behavior with some purpose. Then on the distribution end, which fact checkers normally do not prioritize that much, we see many activities in trying to reach out with the fact checks. And also here we see lots of tech-led practices where platforms, of course, play a significance, and they are very algorithmically driven. So the exposure will depend, and it, as I mentioned with Facebook and TikTok, depends substantially depending on if they are reducing the visibility and the role of the network versus entirely removing content. I want to end with mentioning an article we published in Journalism Studies. What is the problem with misinformation? Fact checking as a socio-technical and problem-solving practice, which is essentially guided by the question, how do fact checkers understand misinformation as a problem for them to solve? And the fact checkers recognize that they can only do so much. They're having limited resources, and fact checking as an epistemic practice where the ultimate outcome is to say this is true or this is false, there's lots at stake, especially in political fact checking. So they need to really engage in verification to a larger extent perhaps than journalists even. And they make lots of prioritization. So in one sense, they learn around what topics and theme is it worth investing their resources where they are likely to be able to come to a successful outcome where they can actually verify something. And ultimately that depends on, are there pre-justified and trustable sources that they can check the claims against. This varies in different national contexts. But again, in platforms, the platforms play huge significance here in terms of fact checkers being largely dependent on platforms to be able to work with fact checking on the platforms in a more efficient and successful way. Of course, there are lots of discussions about the potential roles of automated fact checking and AI, and how AI and automation may help to identify checkable claims, not only in text, but to translate audio and video into a format where fact checkers can see claims which they then can verify. And there is a need for a sort of a collaboration with the platform companies, but also other actors play an important role in this context. Policymakers, authorities in different countries, initiatives for media literacy, the role of the public in critically assessing content and flagging content to platforms or fact checkers, and so forth. And I believe we should transition to some discussion now. So I thank you for the attention, and I hope this has sort of highlighted that journalists, on the one hand, engaging in verification before publishing, and fact checkers engaging in verification before something is published, are both, to different extents, highly dependent on the platforms that we are using in our everyday media lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oscar Westman. I suppose there are different questions. We have now 11 minutes for Q&A. I don't know who wants to start. Is there a question? No. Okay. Lucy, please. Do you want to sit?
Sure.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Lucia Mesquita from Lusófona University. Professor Oscar was perfect, to the point in many senses. I just wanted to clarify a little bit about the black box that you mentioned, because some of the discussions that we have among, specifically on media information literacy and algorithm literacy is that actually the black box is based on the idea that algorithms, or kind of this fallacy of the algorithms, are something rational, that is that there's no human intervention in it, and we know that algorithms are basically based on an idea of success of the data, so that the success of the data is decided by an organization, is decided by the owner, so there is an emotion aspect or a human aspect behind the construction of the algorithms. So the term black box that has been used a lot, it's quite misleading in this sense. So I would prefer something more like a lack of transparency, and AI Act here in Europe is exactly trying to tackle this question, this specific issue. And I wanted to know your ideas about it, or if you could also talk a little bit more about this aspect of the black box and or the fallacy of it, and the lack of transparency and the algorithms in that sense, and how this is affecting not just fact-checking, but journalism and the media in general. Thank you.
Right, yeah, no, the concept is just a shorthand for a concept that many know of, so I chose to use it. Any algorithm has a sort of human inscription of values, and in the case of Facebook, I have myself attended some sessions with Facebook where they have global meetings discussing their algorithms, and I'm very, very impressed by the expertise they have across the globe and across many different disciplines in discussing. For instance, I attended one session when they discussed capital punishment, where they had inquiries from some countries in the Middle East wanted the algorithms to actually display capital punishment so that they would frighten the public, whereas in other countries there is no capital punishment, etc. And so they were discussing this from everything from philosophical and ethical perspectives with people with PhDs in those disciplines to computer scientists of how to actually program the algorithms and so forth. But from the perspective of fact checkers that we have interviewed, to them the fact-checking product of Facebook is something that they expressed discontent with, in the sense that yes, Facebook take lots of pride in having this huge program, everything think that they're doing something good, but from our perspective, we can log into Facebook and we check this site and there is this list with numbers. How did they come up with them? We have no idea, and we look at the list and sometimes it's useful, but oftentimes it's just silly content and it didn't make a meaningful way for them to identify, and in some countries it was meaningful. So some of the fact checkers take pride in having their own ways of identifying, but yet saying we need to make sure that what we work with, at least once a week, is on that list. Otherwise we're not getting paid by Facebook, and otherwise we won't have the partnership. But they don't really know how Facebook produce the list, although they have some idea, of course, because the algorithm looks for content that there's lots of engagement with, that deviates, and if it has potential harm, it can be prioritized. But of course, I don't know transparency exactly what that would.
Thank you. I don't know if there is any more questions. Okay, so I have lots of them, but I will pose one from a Eurocentric perspective, as we are from Europe. So how can Europe actually resist to the influence of algorithms and digital platforms dominated by North American organizations which are shaping the fact-checking processes and amplifying also US aligned political agendas and economic agendas, while empowering journalists and fact-checkers and also audiences to counter the spread of far-right ideologies that of course gained momentum in Europe before, but also they were more significantly fueled by Trump era in the 2016 and now again Trump era politics. And also, how can we look to these policy shifts on platforms like X, for instance, under Elon Musk leadership? So how can we face the North American perspective from the far right and their influence in the platforms, namely on X, but also on other platforms, because they are actually they are intervening in the process of journalism, on journalism making, on fact checking, on the audience's perception, and also I think they are fooling the far right in Europe, in different countries. And for instance, today I was reading a newspaper, and 3 countries in the Nordics are now trying to warn their citizens about a possible war. So what can we do? I don't know. It's a question for $1 million. I know, but
And not only
or
one question,
euros.
many different questions. But I mean, if we start with the relationship between the EU and the platforms, the EU have many different acts, the AI Act and the TSA Act and so forth, in which they work towards, in some way, having more control over the situation in relation to platform companies from the US and also AI companies in China, expecting more transparency from these companies. But I think one of the key problems, of course, is that we as a public are so subsumed by these platforms through our smartphones in our everyday life, giving away our data. So even when they require from the platforms to update their terms and conditions and offering us the possibility of paying for not having all of our data being collected and analyzed and shared with hundreds of different third parties, people are just, oh, it's an update of Instagram, accept it. And yes, continuing with the behaviors. And from the perspective of journalism, we have the problem of this dislocation of news or separation of news from the news institutions and their sort of control of the stories and how it's presented when it's traveling on social media platforms, and also now, of course, in other means, when we can chat with AI about the news. How are these bots sort of choosing what sources they rely on in populating the answers and so forth, if it's a third party. Of course, if the party is like Aftonbladet in Sweden had a chatbot connected to the US election, and then it will be based on their journalism. And I think, from my perspective, in the sense of platform counterbalancing, individual news companies as well as organizations such as INMA and One IFRA are working towards gaining back some of their control, being less dependent on their own. And the transition towards prioritizing reader revenues and having your own data infrastructures goes towards the direction of wanting to have us being loyal directly to the brands. And I think there you can control it. I think you cannot enforce this perfectly upon the platforms. As at that side, of course, we can encourage more work with media and information literacy programs among the general public as well as specific groups such as school youngsters.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there another question there? So please, 1 minute, please. It's the last one.
Hello, Professor Oscar. Thanks for your presentation. Platforms, when I talk about platforms, I get a little anxious because it seems like an impossible thing to deal with. But I have lots of questions, but I will focus on one. And out of curiosity, I would like to know if you have any research or you know about any research on platform cooperatives, or the impact of the Fediverse or alternative social media platforms that use open source and more open, algorithms and things like that. And if these, cooperation between journalists on platforms or the creation of new platforms and the Fediverse as open source social media could be solutions or maybe alternatives, or if we are stuck with the platforms we have right now.
Thank you. I know there have been talks and efforts towards creating search engines that do not track us, such as DuckDuckGo, and initiatives also among some public service broadcasters of creating more, taking back the idea of interactivity, engagement to their platforms, treating the audience not as a commodity that's being sold to third parties, but the audience as a democratic member of society which is not being traced. But I think it's fair to say if we need to ask if there are successful social media companies that treat us in such way and we don't come up with the answers, there are no successful ones of huge importance. And I mean, ever since Musk took over Twitter, transformed it into X, there's been sort of a transition towards other potential formats. Now we're seeing a transition to Blue Sky, and it's a discussion, will that be a new sort of platform where we can have discussions with sort of also discussion. It's not happening as much there because the user base is smaller. Maybe one day the transitions will take place and we'll see such things take off, but I don't see that they're at the moment sort of really competing with the big commercial platform companies.
Okay, so we are going to end this session. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Professor Oscar Westland. It was very interesting, and now we will have our final session, our ending session of this conference with the PI of the project, Pedro Jones.
Question for you. And it's part of our
Agora o João pode gastar o voo. Então, o que é que nos resta dizer? Eu, da minha parte, manifestar, já agradecer a vossa presença, aqueles que submeteram propostas a esta conferência, sublinhar aquilo que já fomos dizendo, não queríamos uma conferência de massas. Eu acho que, fazendo um balanço deste dia e meio, acho que permitiu aquilo que nos tínhamos proposto fazer, que é podermos, somos menos pessoas, contactar, conviver, partilhar e sobretudo eu acho, há dois aspectos que eu destacaria deste dia e meio, não só a partilha, mas sobretudo as portas abertas que ficaram para prosseguir pesquisa mesmo depois do projeto terminar em alguns pontos. Estou a lembrar-me, sei lá, até quando falava com a Tirana, que nos tem estado a estudar na Europa os desertos de notícias, é um projeto que já não tem financiamento. Este aqui, o Perto dos Desertos de Notícias, é um aspecto do projeto que também vai terminar em janeiro, mas fica a porta aberta para prosseguirmos a pesquisa nesse campo e outros. Agradeço a vossa generosidade, o feedback que tenho estado a receber tem sido muito bom. Agradecemos, e eu aqui queria pedir, e aliás a isso que se levantasse, para vocês saberem quem é que foi responsável pela imagem de uma salva de palmas na campanha. O projeto, esta conferência também, nos muitos elogios que tivemos, foi muito à questão da comunicação, a imagem, e foi uma ideia da Thaís, acho que foi uma excelente ideia. Partilhamos queríamos partilhar com ela naturalmente, porque foi uma ideia dela e acho que ajudou que esta conferência fosse um bocadinho mais também por aí. Em termos de projeto, continuaremos até janeiro, ainda temos coisas para publicar mais, para tirar cá para fora, o MediaTrust.Lab, os MOOCs, e da minha parte não me ocorre mais nada a não ser agradecer, reforçar esse agradecimento à equipa, à vossa presença. Continuamos aqui de portas abertas para continuar a fazer coisas juntos. Passo a palavra a Inês, que também terá algo a dizer ultimamente.
Tenho sempre, mas agora será a hora do almoço. Só dizer-vos que ou saiu hoje, ou acabou de sair, ou está a sair, recebi um e-mail, um artigo nosso entre ou três projetos, o MediaTrust.Lab, e o Digital e o MyGender. Portanto, a convergência dos projetos também funciona. As ciências da comunicação em Portugal funcionam, estão vivas. Não funcionam se estivermos nas capelinhas. Portanto, sairmos das capelinhas e sairmos das politiquices institucionais, as coisas funcionam muito bem. Eu ontem não referi uma pessoa que também está num projeto, na altura estava aqui no MUBI também numa outra situação precária, que agora está numa boa situação no Porto, que é o Ricardo Moraes. A nossa equipa é muito extensa. Eu quero novamente agradecer ao Pedro, como já fiz na sessão de abertura, mas também agradecer muito às restantes pessoas do projeto e muito em particular à Luísa, à Tatiana e à Cibel, que de facto têm estado connosco e que não só fazem parte da dita Wonder Team que o Pedro referiu, que é o nome do nosso grupo no WhatsApp, mas sobretudo nos ajudam a ir muito além deste projeto e, portanto, nesse sentido, este projeto funcionou muito bem, não só porque tivemos uma excelente equipa, mas porque tivemos recursos humanos que contratámos, que se transformaram não só na equipa, mas pessoas em quem confiámos e, portanto, nós tivemos nessa lógica top-down que funciona, acho, mal nos projetos, e por isso que o projeto vai além, não é só por causa do Pedro, não é só por causa de mim, mas é muito por causa da Luísa, da Tatiana e da Cibel e, portanto, para elas, o nosso obrigada. E obrigada a todos e todas.
Isto também reforçar que isto tem que ser feito partilhado, porque subscrevo 300% aquilo que fizeste nesta parte final. De facto, é o nosso grupo A4, sobretudo, foi assim, foi o que deu o nome à equipa, porque de facto é isso. As pessoas, quando aliamos competência, só sublinhar isto e vamos já calar, a competência académica e profissional com o fundo que as pessoas são, ajuda, e eu já passei por outros projetos, ajuda a que tudo seja melhor e até que se consiga fazer mais do que o que está previsto. Porque, de facto, quando as coisas funcionam assim é sempre bom e é um prazer fazer, no meio destas questões todas, burocracias que já sabemos e precariedades em alguns casos, no meu em particular, é completamente diferente de conseguir fazer ciência em Portugal. Claro que o financiamento é fundamental, a estabilidade é fundamental, mas quando temos pessoas, porque é disso que se trata, de pessoas para pessoas, quando é assim, quando temos uma equipa assim, é muito mais fácil fazer ciência. Muito obrigado.
I'd just like to invite everyone to take a picture.
Of course. Aqui ou... Depois é melhor, porque ele tem que se afastar. Sim.
Microfone?
Listen,